hopefully you can all see that there. And I will be in the picture, I hope, and there we go. All righty. We're talking about the blame game. Now, for those of you who are in the coaching program, you have heard parts of this already, but we decided it needed to be available for the wider community as well. So we're starting with that. I'm going to do that. Blame is one of the cognitive distortions. And that cognitive distortion is a way of thinking, sort of an incorrect pathway through the brain that distorts our experience. And it creates a scenario that doesn't actually exist except in our heads. And this cognitive distortions are a lot of what lead to depression, a lot of what lead to, according to literature, a lot of suicide comes out of a lot of cognitive distortions because people create the scenario that isn't there and then they can't get out of it. It's really a habit of thinking in an incorrect way, but it is simply you talking yourself into something that isn't correct. And I know we've thought about the telephone game before, and often that is very similar to how a distortion gets started. So somebody says something and it gets copied to the next person, copied to the next person, copied to the next person, copied to the next person. And the last person, what they say has very little to do with what the first person said, because each time it got switched a little bit more. Except that you're not talking to other people, you're talking to yourself. It's the game in your head that's causing this. So you have an experience and you tell yourself this, and because you told yourself that, well, then you think this, and think that, then this, and you keep creating more and more and more distortions in what you're saying and hearing, and until you've completely created something that wasn't there to start with. And that's what we mean by a cognitive distortion. So don't let the big words get in the way, but it's how our brain leads us down the path with, well, if this happened, well, then it must be because of that. And then that must be because of that and that and that. And we kind of create ourselves this route, and we end up going over and over and over the same route until we believe it. And you tell yourself the same thing often enough, eventually you will believe it. There are actually about 20 common distortions that are recognized by the psychological world and by the self-help world. We know that these things are sort of common problems in the way people think, and we all do them occasionally, and that's okay. There's not a problem when you do it occasionally. It's when you get into this habitual way of thinking and you continuously tell yourself the same thing or continuously interpret something in the same way, and you can't step back and look at it and go, oh, I might not have read that the right way, or I might have misinterpreted that, or maybe that's not really what it means. When you can't step back and do that anymore, then it's become a problem. And so you would recognize yourself in a lot of the different cognitive distortions, and we have done other workshops on some of the other ones as well. We'll probably do some more as well, but this particular one that we're going to focus on today, I'm quite sure we have all done it on occasion, and on occasion it's not a problem. It's when it becomes the habit, when it becomes the sort of default way of thinking, that then it becomes a problem. It's an unhelpful thinking style. That's about the clearest we can say. It's a way of thinking that enables us to interpret the world in a false way. We always interpret the world around us. We have to see something and figure out what it means to us. That's normal. But when we start taking shortcuts and assume that, well, because it happened this way once, every time it's going to mean that, then things don't go so well. And we often take shortcuts, which is a normal way. We learn habits for a reason. Our brain would get overwhelmed if we didn't take shortcuts. But when those shortcuts aren't accurate, then it creates a lot of problems for us. And when we allow bias and distortion in our thinking, then our cognitive shortcuts become a problem. And so if you think about the shortcut as being, for instance, you know that when you're in heavy traffic, you tend to get nervous. And so you want the kids to be quiet, you want the sound on the radio turned down. You want to be able to focus and think about that, and you cut out everything else that's going on. And that's a perfectly good reason to distort your reality and ignore a bunch of stuff that's going on. But when you do that all the time and not just when you're in heavy traffic, then your brain has taken this shortcut that goes, oh, I can ignore everything because I want to focus on this. Then it's going to create problems in other areas of your life. And these distortions tend to happen automatically. We don't intend to think inaccurately. We don't intend to take bad shortcuts. But unless we notice them and pay attention to that's what we're doing, they will have very powerful effects on our mood and on our lives. And so a lot of what I want you to get out of today is that you become aware of when you're doing it so that you can catch yourself and step back and go, is that really where I want to go with this? Is that really how I want to understand this? Is that really what the story I want to put on this? So we want you to catch yourself when you're doing it, because when you catch yourself, then you can change the shortcut. The one we want to focus on today is blame, the blame game. And blame has two aspects to it, and that is blaming others while denying your own role in it, and personalization. It's kind of two sides to the same coin. Personalization is blaming yourself when you're not actually responsible for it. And we tend to do both, and a person who does a lot of one will often do a lot of the other as well, but not always. Some people only do one and not the other, and some people do both. So kind of think about for a moment, do you tend to put the blame on other people so that it's not your responsibility, it's not you weren't the cause of the situation, it's not your fault? All those, if cause and fault and blame need to be assigned to others, then blaming is the name. If it's, oh, but it can't be their fault, I must have done something wrong, it must have been me, I didn't say that right, or I provoked them, or I did something that bothered them, and you're taking the blame on yourself when their behavior is the problem. So we're going to call it all the blame game, but it has those two sides. And pay attention to which one you tend to use the most. And has this become a habitual way of dealing with the world for you? If it has, then it's a problem. If you catch yourself doing it occasionally, but most of the time you're pretty good at it, then this isn't a problem for you, but you'll recognize it when other people are doing it, and will hopefully give you some strategies on how to deal with that when somebody else is doing it. And not all blame is bad. Blame is a common human reaction to negative consequences. And to tell you the honest truth, for most people, it feels better to find fault in somebody else instead of looking in the mirror. We use blame as a defense mechanism, and it helps you keep your self-esteem by keeping you unaware or evading the awareness of your own failings and flaws. And you know, in certain times, that's okay. The occasional time, it's not a problem. But if that's the way you're doing it all the time, then avoiding your awareness, not looking at what is your role in it, what are you doing in this, then you're not going to grow from it. You won't develop better skills. You won't learn to be responsible for yourself. Dr. Burns is one of the key researchers who's done a lot of work around this area. And he says, you assume responsibility for a negative, even when there's no basis for doing so. You arbitrarily conclude that what happened was your fault or reflects your inadequacy, even when you are not responsible for it. That's the self-blame one. That's the side where, and we may not say that we blame ourselves for it, but we make ourselves responsible for it. We take on the responsibility that if we had just done something different or just acted differently or said something different, then things would be different. So we may not use the word blame, but we personalize the situation and make us the center of it. It's really a very egotistical, a very self-centered approach to life where everything that happens around you is your responsibility and your problem, and you need to fix it and you need to be the one responsible for it. And that's not a healthy place to be living. Self-blame is also very common in bullying and abuse situations. The victim tends to blame themselves for provoking the situation. So when you have someone who's in a bullying situation or is the victim of abuse or some kind of a situation where someone else is acting inappropriately towards that person, how is that affecting that person's self-esteem? And is it teaching them to blame themselves? Because the way to avoid that situation, the easy way out, is take the blame on themselves and make it their problem. But that, in the long run, is not a healthy way to deal with it. So let's look at a couple of situations where blame tends to run quite quickly and easily. In relationships, or in work, in social club things. The if only I was something or other, and some personal attribute goes there. Younger, or more beautiful, or thinner, or faster, or richer, or whatever attribute you think the other person is looking for. If only I was that, I would have gotten what I wanted. Without recognizing that much of that situation is totally beyond your control. Much of it has nothing to do with you. And you've probably heard this before, but you know, up until about 40, most of us think that other people are spending a lot of time thinking about us and, you know, paying attention to us. And by the time you get to about 60, you realize most of the time, nobody's paying any attention to you whatsoever. They don't really care. They may use you as a target of blame to deflect from themselves, but they're really not worried about what you are doing. And yet the blame game keeps us as the center of the world. It keeps the person as the egotistical source of everything that's happening out there. And whatever attribute it is that they think they're missing, they blame themselves for, because they didn't get what they wanted because they have that attribute. And it's a very insidious way of digging down at yourself, of putting yourself down, of not focusing on what's actually going on, not observing the situation and seeing all of the players at play, not seeing all of the aspects at play, and simply taking your own faults as being the cause. The second aspect of blame is, if only I didn't say that, then they wouldn't have. And again, it's a very egotistical, it's my fault for everything. I'm the center of the universe and I make things happen. And I make bad things happen to me. Well, I'm not sure that's really a true statement. Wouldn't really matter if you said that. If someone's going to be a bully or abusive, they're likely to be that anyway. And you're saying something or not saying something might have pushed a button for them and caused them to explode, but they exploded on their own, and they would have done it whether or not you were there. Could have been somebody else or something else. You need to really look at your role in it and be able to step back and say, I said something there, but that response to it was not an appropriate response to what was said or done. And their reaction or their overreaction, their blow up, their explosion, their whatever they did was not in relationship to whatever you did. And that if only I didn't say that or do that or whatever is blaming yourself for something that is someone else's responsibility. You actually cannot control or dictate or cause them to act or think or feel in any particular way. And learning to recognize that boundaries and appropriate boundaries, appropriate self-defense by not responding to people like that is a really important skill to learn. But don't fall for the if only I had, or if only I'd said, if only I didn't. That's blaming yourself for behavior that is beyond yourself. And then on the other side, we have somebody where we're blaming somebody else. If only she hadn't yelled at me, I wouldn't have been angry and I wouldn't have had the car accident. So you had a car accident, but it's the fault of somebody who yelled at you in the afternoon. I don't think so. The fact that you're still upset about that and distracted and chose to drive while you weren't in a good frame of mind is not the responsibility of the person who yelled at you. That's your choice. And that's where really understanding what responsibility means is so important. The model we want to look at is self-responsibility. It's not blame and it's not personalization. Blaming everybody else or blaming yourself rarely works. Self-responsibility is the model that says you look within and accept responsibility for who you are, for what you've become, and for your present circumstances. And it's probably one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but it's also one of the things that'll cause the most growth and development and lead to the most balance and harmony in your life. When you realize that you have power over your life and only your life, nobody else's, that you have the ability to write your future, and you do that by making choices and putting boundaries in place and honoring them, then you will find a renewed sense of fulfillment and purpose. Things like making agreements. We've talked about that in our coaching as well. Things like putting boundaries into place. Things like being willing to walk away from things. All of the skills that you have to be responsible for yourself and not take responsibility for something that isn't yours will allow you to be different in all of these situations. So the mindset change I want you to walk away with is, I am only responsible for me. Now, obviously, if you're a mother with young kids, you're also responsible for them. If you're an employer, you're responsible in a certain aspect for your employees. But we're talking here about the emotional games that people play in the blame game. And yes, it takes place even in businesses and in homes and in social clubs and in soccer clubs and in everywhere. And one of the best things you can do is teach your kids this as well. I am only responsible for me. You cannot make anyone feel or react in a particular way. You can push their buttons, but their actions, their feelings, and their emotions are their responsibility, not yours. And many times people will say something not realizing or not understanding that for that particular person, that's a wound or a sore spot, and it will cause a huge blow up. But that is not the responsibility of the person who said something. That is the responsibility of the person who has a wound and hasn't dealt with it. You, no matter how you try, cannot control the emotions and feelings of someone else. That's their work to do. Your work is to learn how to not only control, but also to manage and release and maintain calm, smooth emotions. It's your job to control yourself, be responsible for yourself, make the choices and actions that are appropriate for you, and not worry about everybody else's. The other person is responsible for their emotions and reactions, and it's perfectly all right for you to stand back and observe, and instead of getting pulled into their drama, go, they're having a problem. I think I'll just walk away until they calm down, and this is not the time to deal with it. It's perfectly okay to say to someone, sorry, right now I'm not going to engage in that. We can talk about this later when we can do so calmly. Those are the kinds of boundaries and things that you need in place, but can only happen when you have control of your own emotions. And you get control of your emotions by doing the subconscious work, by releasing the triggers, by addressing the fears and the beliefs behind them, by becoming accepting of yourself and recognizing you are not the center of the world. Not everything revolves around you. And it's perfectly okay for other people to do their own thing. And that many times the people that you need to relate with are in a different place than you are. And they may not have the personal resources. They may not have the personal understanding, the personal skills, the personal responsibility to create appropriate reactions. And your job is to respect the fact that they are where they are in their life's journey, and that's okay. They have some learning to do, and that's okay. You need to be where you need to be, and part of your job is to simply observe and say, okay, not going there. Not going to get dragged into that drama. They have an issue. They have some things they need to deal with, and I refuse to engage in a time when they are already out of control, and my engaging with it in some way would make it worse. And allowing that to happen. Being the bigger person and recognizing that everybody has their own problems. And believe me, none of us are perfect. None of us do this perfectly. But getting to the point where we can be that step back observer and go, that's not working, let's try something different, as opposed to getting into a fight over it, is a huge step for you. And it's the I am only responsible for me approach that will get you there. So how do we stop these distortions when we find ourselves being caught in them, when we find ourselves being pulled into the blame game, whether it's blaming ourselves? And I don't know about you, but most of us are really, really good at blaming ourselves and talking down to ourselves and ripping ourselves up and being pretty nasty at ourselves when we are in one of those distortions, when we are in the blame, when we're taking blame for something that we didn't do, or something that we are not responsible for, or when we're in a situation where it's like, even to some degree, if it is your fault, you did something wrong, you said something inappropriate, you missed something, you totally blanked out on something. There are times when, yes, there is appropriate blame, but then all of that ripping ourselves down and telling ourselves how stupid we are and how terrible we are and how all this we are isn't helpful. And when you become aware of it, then you can stop back and say, oh, I shouldn't be doing that. That's not where I want to be. And that's what we need to do, is to be able to catch ourselves when we're in that irrational thought pattern. Because once you're aware of it, you can reverse it. Once you've caught yourself in it, you can go, oh, that's not how I want to deal with this. Now, there are times when you need to reach out to a wellness professional because the situation is too overwhelming, the process is too overwhelming, and you may well need some natural bioenergetics corrections. You may well need to speak with a counselor. You may well need some anger management classes. Those are all very good options. But when it comes down to it, it's a matter of catching ourselves into that thought, being able to step back and go, that's not the way I want to deal with it. Here's how I want to deal with it. And you can only do that when you are dealing with your own work internally. And remember, it's not the events that bother you most of the time. It's your thoughts, your interpretation, the story you put onto it, your past history related to it. That's what upsets you about it. And that's all in your head. The event can happen, but how you bring past experiences into it, the story you put onto it, the beliefs you have around it, that's what upsets you. So you can deal with all of those things. Those things, there are tools and ways to help you with those. The event itself is actually rather neutral most of the time, even though it doesn't seem or feel very neutral. And it may be aggressive by someone else, but your reaction is still what matters. That's what upsets you. You don't get upset because the event happened. You get upset because of all the baggage that comes with the event. And even though you can't change the event, you can redirect your thoughts around it and change the way you respond to it. So some tips on doing this. Thinking about your thoughts. If an event is upsetting you, step back if you can. Just remove yourself from the situation for a few moments and focus on, what are you telling yourself about this event? Why is it triggering so many old things? Why is it creating a problem for you? Why is it bringing up emotions to you that may not be in proportion to the event that's actually going on? So that ability to learn to step back and be the observer of what is, and to think about your thoughts is a really important skill to develop. And it is a skill that anyone can develop. It's a matter of consciously choosing to go, oh, I don't like the way I just did that. I'm going to step back and do something different. I want to think about it before I respond. I want to put myself in a different place, and I want to explore what I'm thinking before I respond. And that is a skill that we can all learn. And coming from someone who, as a child, had no concept that that was possible, whose brain just spewed out whatever was there, believe me, I can tell you it is a skill you can learn. The other thing that will really help you with is if you can, as you're thinking about your thoughts, when you recognize the pattern, replace the statements of always and nothing, or always and never, with something less hard, with something less fixed. Because it's really rare that something is always that way, maybe most of the time, but there are options. There have been times when it was different, where you can go to a different example. Very few things are always and never or nothing. And if you can change your vocabulary to sometimes it happens this way, or many times this is what I experience, or this is what I experience, instead of always, but this is what I'm experiencing right now. This is what I'm feeling right now, without bringing in all the other events around it, will help you to process it more efficiently and help you to be less upset about it, help you to bring less of the other stories and experiences and background into it. Words matter, and how you speak to yourself and how you talk to others as well as yourself really makes a difference. And you can defuse a situation by changing those words. Labeling is a big part of this. We define ourselves and we define others, especially when we're blaming ourselves and when we're blaming others. We tend to put labels onto them, onto the person, onto ourselves. What would happen if you labeled the behavior instead of the person? So instead of saying, oh, I'm so lazy because I didn't get the kitchen clean today, what if you just said, didn't get the kitchen clean today? Or instead of saying, oh, my partner never cleans the bathroom and it's such a mess and he didn't do it, he was supposed to do it today and he didn't do it again. And so he's such a lazy slob and he won't do. All the words and labels that come out at the person instead of the behavior. You can diffuse a lot of the anger. You can diffuse a lot of the problems by talking about the behavior as opposed to the person. And particularly for yourself, when you keep telling yourself you're something over and over, you will become that. Just like we know children, when they're set, if you tell a child over and over and over, you're useless, good for nothing, whatever, they most of the time become that. Occasionally there'll be some intervention in their life that helps them not become that, but without some help, they're most likely to become that. And there's lots of studies showing that that's a real thing. So don't label yourself, don't label somebody else. Keep the focus on the behavior in the present, not the every time, always, never. In the present, now, on the behavior, and you'll find you can deal with situations without getting into the blame game. And if you're one of those ones who blame yourself for everything and tend to have a little bit of a victim bent, then try searching for some of the positive aspects. Now, we also teach about toxic positivity, where that can go too far. But in every event, if you've got all the negative over here, looking for a little bit of positive over here just kind of balances it out a little bit. So we're not saying, don't throw everything out and say, oh, it's all fine, but just try to balance it a little bit by saying, these are going on, these are not good, but there is this aspect that is got some light in it. And so just trying to bring a little more balance to the situation will also help you feel less need to blame yourself. And for some people, it can be very challenging to find positive aspects in a situation. And it will not feel normal. will not feel natural. But remember, it's a habit of trying to teach your brain to get out of a distortion where everything is always this and going, this is happening right now. And your brain automatically wants to go to the whole scenario, but you can go, but you know what? This is also happening right now, and give it a little bit of balance. And that little bit of balance will often help just pull the negative back in a little ways, so you're not quite so likely to blame yourself or do as much of it. And it's just a way of balancing a little over. So as you're trying to calm yourself down, think about your thoughts, change how you're defining the behavior, avoiding the extremes in language. Look at ways where you can find a little bit of positive in it. Whether that positive is even just things like, you know what, in this situation, normally I would be breaking down in tears and running and crying, and I'm standing here thinking instead. That's a positive. Or I caught myself before I blamed myself. That's a positive. Just whatever you can do to get a little bit of balance into the situation will be helpful. And the last tip I want to give you on this is, for the blame towards others or towards yourself, is there actually any evidence? Ask yourself, is there any evidence? Before you jump to a conclusion that yes, it's your fault, and yes, you were the problem, and if you had only not done this, or it's, well, they always do that, and that's it's always their problem. Before you jump to those conclusions, consider asking and investigating and questioning to make sure you have all the facts. And then make an extra effort to believe those facts. And I think you'll find blame is much less easy to assign either to yourself or to someone else when you actually have the facts and believe the facts. So look for the evidence, gather the evidence, think about the evidence. Those things will help you. And just like any other muscle, the mind is a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets and the more it can expand. And if you are exercising the blame side and continuously in that rut, it will get stronger and stronger and bigger, whether that blame is towards yourself or towards other people. And on the other side, if you exercise the, I need to step back here, I need to think about this, I'm not going to make a choice yet, I'm going to explore it, I'm going to observe it, I'm going to look for evidence, then that ability to stay calm and rational and respond in a way that you want to respond, rather than just letting emotions spew and end up in a disagreement or a fight or crying or whatever kind of explosion ends up, you want to exercise your staying calm muscles. And the more you exercise them, the less the other ones, the more the other ones will decrease. What you put your effort into is what you're going to get. So if you're continuing to just carry on in the same track, you'll just wear that rut stronger. And then once you get that rut really strong, it can be difficult to change. But as you begin to build a new rut, begin to build a new path, the more you do it, the better it gets and the more power it takes away from the other one, because it's not being exercised. Oops. All right, there we are. That's it. I'm going to stop the share there. We'll come back to here. It's really important in how you treat yourself and how you treat others that you begin to develop this self-responsibility. And that's really the core of what we're doing in our coaching program as well, is helping you develop that self-responsibility. And if you want some help with that, we would love to chat with you about being in the coaching program. We'd love to have more of you in there. If you know someone who would benefit from it, we'd be delighted to chat with them. I'm going to open it up here for some questions. I'll look at the chat box because I see there's one in there. Thank you, Marjorie, for sharing that. Makes me think of my sis recently accusing me of pushing her buttons. And I was like, what? We often don't recognize what we're doing. And yet the other person blames us for something. If we're not actually doing it and they're blaming us and we're just not aware of it, there's things to look at there. But many times we haven't done anything at all. We're perfectly within our range of normal behavior, not accusing, not doing anything, but they have their own issues. They have their own problems. They have their own wounds. They have their own emotional traumas that are not dealt with. And the way they deal with it is to dump the blame onto somebody else. And that's where our self-responsibility then needs to allow us to step back and go, that's their problem, not mine. I don't need to accept that. I don't need to take it personally. I don't need to feel bad because they said that. I don't need to react because they said that. I can recognize that they're having a problem that they need to deal with and let it go at that. Right, any other questions or comments that anyone would like to share? You can throw them in the chat box, or if you want to put your hand